Okay, all right. So today we're going to finish up the last piece of section 8, which is the doctrine of creation. And remember, last week we ended with talking about how God's creation, thinking about, especially the New Testament writing. You know, it's a Greco-Roman world. So a lot of what Christianity is a reaction. It's a reactionary movement, right? It's reactionary to the injustices that Jesus sees within his own religious system, right? So he rails against the religious leaders in the Roman province of Judea. But as Christianity now moves into the Mediterranean world, it now takes on a movement. Now it's now moving against some of the other systems, right? The political system, the worldly systems, the systems of the Gentiles. Right? Sounds like a good rock band. System of the Gentiles, yeah. So anyway, so remember last week we ended with talking about bodily, physical life is good. And this is important because this is going to lead us into our next section. So, this is contradictory to Platonic theory, right? And Platonic is taught by Plato, right, exactly. So Plato taught body is bad, soul is good. Your soul is trapped, jailed, kind of, by the body. And when the body dies, the soul is released into, whatever, till it gets to where it needs to go. And so Christianity now teaches, well, the body is not like that. You know, the body is good, it's created by God, right? And this is a Jewish concept, right? As Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, a Jewish teacher. So it's interesting because you are now, when you leave this little dot called Judea, right, the Roman province of Judea, and now you enter a bigger world, it's Greco-Roman, right? It is heavily influenced by the Greeks and, of course, by the Romans who have now Romanized the Mediterranean world. So when you say, well, no, the body is not bad, when lots of people believe that it is bad because this is what Plato taught, right? So this also has influenced Christianity, right? There was a statement that I've heard a long time ago that sticks with me, is that you cannot teach Christ, well, you cannot have Christ without Caesar, and you cannot have Caesar without Christ. So the both of them influence each other. So there are branches of Christianity who look at the body as being evil, right? Flesh is bad. And they will go to an extreme, almost very much like a Platonist. And so you cannot argue, you can't miss that argument that
the Gnostics were like this.
The Gnostics were exactly like that, right? And there was Gnosticism, and then there's like Christianized Gnosticism that gets in and says, well, if the flesh, our bodies, if they're evil, well, then Jesus didn't have a body.
Right.
Because if Jesus is God, Jesus only appeared to have a body. That means he only appeared to eat. He appeared to drink. He appeared to...
He was a hologram.
Yeah, kind of like a hologram. Right, yes. Kind of like an ancient hologram. So he only appeared to be nailed to a cross. Right? So... Yeah, and so that's why I have a big issue with Christian Gnosticism, because it's, you take out all the humanity of Jesus and who he was, right, and that's a perfect example of how Greco culture and philosophical understandings has influenced the church, and it has, all right. So it's in there, like the old. I think it was at the old Ragu commercials. It's in there. It's in there. And sometimes, as theologians, you have to weed your garden. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, we do the same thing, right? This whole prosperity gospel, health and wealth. As a minister, I'm continually weeding the garden.
Osteen or whoever.
Yes, and there's lots of them.
Right.
I'm sure they're good people, but I don't like their theologies. So I'm continually weeding the garden. Don't read that. Don't. It's not if you pray hard enough. If Jesus suffered, Jesus said, if they do it to the master, they will do it to the servants. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean that, we're promised, a perfect life. It means that we're promised that we won't go through this life alone. And there's eternal life at the end. So Life can be rough, and that's okay. Life was rough for Christ too. So, yeah. So, that's part of it. Temporal life is good. It's the good news in that every individual has meaning, contradicting the pessimistic Greek worldview. So, it contradicts. Now Christianity is moving throughout the Mediterranean world. It is now coming into contact and going against the grain of popular Gentile thought. So the Jews had now dealt with this, and now the rest of the world is now going to begin dealing with the teachings of this Jewish rabbi. And they're still dealing with the teachings of this Jewish rabbi. All right, good, but not good. Guthrie opens up in his final piece for this section. And in 162, we have a small paragraph. We have stressed as strongly as possible the goodness of everything God has made. The doctrine of creation makes us free for a thankful, joyful, responsible, worldly life. We do not qualify, but only underline what we have said when we now emphasize just as strongly that although the created world is good, it is not God. This seemingly obvious statement has two very important consequences that are not so obvious. All right, so one, nothing in the world is to be feared. We see what good news this is when we consider the fact that Christian tradition has interpreted God's creation of heaven and earth to mean God's creation of all things visible and invisible, right? Christ said, you only are to fear what can destroy the spirit, right? And there's only one being that can do that, right? So nothing in this world is to be feared.
And also the thing at the top of our program, now I know that I can
Do all things.
for God is with me, or whatever. Yeah, I forget the exact.
You took like a 12-step?
No, at the top of our
Philippians.
program.
Oh, yes. Right, the bulletin, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, it's definitely a no fear kind of
That's right.
theme
Right.
there.
So we are not to fear anything in creation, although your pastor fears heights and does not like cockroaches. But I don't know if Jesus.
Same way.
Yeah, I don't know if Jesus was thinking about that when he made that statement. But my wife doesn't like spiders. That's not so much what they're talking about.
Right.
I mean, we all have phobias, but we're not to fear anything. We are only to fear God. And that's a term of respect, right? We are to respect it and only be afraid of the one that can destroy the spirit. That's it. And then he says, because the whole world and everything in it depends on God for its very existence. Nothing in all creation can have absolute and undefeatable control over us. All right? So nothing can. Only God, right? We are in God's hand. And the final piece that Guthrie brings out, for good but not God, is nothing in the world is to be worshipped. The doctrine of creation is a great warning and a battle cry against all forms of idolatry. Idolatry is by definition giving absolute loyalty to something that is only a creature rather than its creator. All right? And if you want examples of that, I can probably give you so many your head would spin off. The Hebrew Scriptures has tons of them. We had our study in 1st, 2nd Samuel and 1st, 2nd Kings. I mean, think about how much idolatry we read in those 4 books. I mean, it's like oodles of it. But idolatry doesn't always have to come in the form of an Asherah pole or a high place. It's anything that we stick between us and God. Right? So it could be anything that that we worship or that we get stuck on, that it becomes idolatrous. So idolatry can come in many forms other than a golden calf, right? And so we can get stuck in these things. So again, it's worship the Creator, not the creation. Now we can enjoy the creation, right? That's what we're supposed to do. We enjoy it. We can find beauty in it. We can say, this is, proof to me that there is a creator. There's lots of things that we can do. We're to take care of it, right? We are, called to be stewards of God's creation, but we are just not to worship it. Right? And that's the line. And that's the line. So theologically, this is a big piece. If you think about in the Corinthian letters, when Paul gets the letter saying, we have an issue here. Some people are buying meat from the market that had been worshipped up to idols because it's cheap and it's good. It's good cuts of meat. So what do we do? Because some people don't have an issue with it. They say, well, that's just an idol. It's a piece of wood. It's not real. Why not? That's a great piece of rump. I'll have a great roast I want to make with this. But some of the Christians in that community have an issue with that. All right? They might be recent converts of Christianity. And so Paul now has to address this issue. He uses the term weak and strong Christians. And weak here is not an insult. Paul is not using weak as saying, like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with you? No, Paul is saying you must be careful for those who have an issue with this, right? We're not to divide the body over this. And so, so idolatry appears in many places, in many ways, in how we have to deal with it. And so even in the form of buying dinner that night, it appears. It appears. So how we view it and how we understand it, and this is what theological study is all about. It's building your own system so you can be able to make these decisions and understand how your faith works. Almost like you have a beautiful grandfather clock that has been given to you, and you just want to understand how that clock works. So you study everything about that clock to understand how that clock works. It's kind of like theology, right? The world we live in, our faith, we understand that, and now it's using theology to kind of blueprint it and try to understand, how exactly it works. All right, any questions before we move on to our next section? All right, so our next section, section 9, is God, the creator and creation. We're still in that piece here. And this one, the subtitle is, Why Doesn't God Do Something About It? And so now we're going to get into, I need to give them out, don't I? Yeah, it probably would help, right? Everyone's sitting there like, what is he talking about? Making sure I give out the right ones. And I'll give you one to pass to Alan, and then I'll give 2 this way.
Oh, okay.
You and Don?
He's coming this way.
Yep.
Thank you.
There is a method to my madness, I promise. So the subtitle is, Why Doesn't God Do Something About It? So we're now going to start, we've had this class for how many weeks?
But at least 27 weeks now.
27 weeks?
25.
All right, 25. We've had this for enough weeks, so now we're going to start using the theology that we've learned, and we're going to talk about real life situations to be able to understand them. And we're going to start to get that in this section. And I really like this section. And this section is called The Doctrine of Providence and the Problem of Evil. And so we're going to deal with some stuff. And I'm going to ask you, like a math teacher or professor would do. You've learned how to do your basic stuff, and now we're going to build upon that. Right? That's where I would start getting nervous when I was in high school. I was never that good in math. So, but it works like math. It's like building blocks. All right, and remember the rules that you have learned, and remember the earlier lessons, because they will shape how we look at things theologically for a Reformed perspective. And it is for a Reformed perspective, right? If this was a Methodist church, you'd be learning something a little bit different. If it was Roman Catholic, you'd be learning something a little bit different. Lutheran, the same. So remember, this is just one way to look at things. It's one way of looking at things. It just happens to be
way.
Right, our way. The right way. There's a Calvinist at heart. All right, so we're going to open up with the introduction to providence and the problem of evil, and we're going to go to 166 and 167 in Guthrie, and we're going to hear his introduction to this section. The doctrine of providence is an extension of the doctrine of creation. It says that the loving, just, and powerful God, who first made heaven and earth, continues to uphold, protect, rule over, take care of, provide for God's good creation and each one of us. Everything we have said about the Creator and what we have to say now about God the Provider sounds very nice for children in Sunday school, preachers and theologians, and people standing up to confess their faith in quiet sanctuaries with stained glass windows they can't see through to see what life in the world is really like. That world is a world plagued by cancer, the torments of mental illness, battered women and children, bloody wars, millions of homeless and starving people around the world, the spread of the deadly AIDS virus, suffering and injustice of all kinds everywhere. How can Christians be so naive and sentimental in their glib talk about a powerful God of love and justice at work in the world? Given the kind of world we really live in, we must not conclude that there is a God at all. That God must be either loving and just but not powerful enough to do anything about it, or powerful but not loving and just enough to do anything about it. A God who is either willing to prevent evil but not able, or able but not willing. Is that not our alternative if we believe in God at all? That is the problem we will consider in this chapter. First, we will acknowledge the reality of evil that challenges everything Christians believe about God. Then, following a distinction philosophers and theologians of all traditions make between two kinds of evil, we will consider how Christians understand the nature and origin of the dark side of creation, natural evil, and the powers of darkness, moral evil. Finally, we will discuss the light shining in the darkness, the Christian doctrine of providence, and its implication for our lives. All right, so in this section, we're going to look at two forms of evil that Guthrie brings up. The dark side of creation, or every time I read that I want to say the dark side of the moon. Right. The dark side of creation, which is natural evil. And what would you think of natural evil?
Diseases.
Yes, good. What else? Dark side of creation. What else happens?
Natural disasters.
Natural disasters, yeah, of all sorts. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, all of those things, right? Mudslides. We would consider those to be natural evil. Things that naturally occur because Mom Earth gets angry, right? So, and then the powers of darkness, a moral evil, what would those be?
Stealing, murder.
Yes. They are acts of evil committed by people. All right? So there are two things that Guthrie, so this is how we're going to break these down within this chapter. They are natural evils, things that we really cannot control, and there are moral evils. They are the evils inflicted upon humanity by yours truly, people from the human race. Okay? All right, so that's how this is going to work, this chapter. And it is, Guthrie opens up by saying, up to this point, there's been a fun, happy little theological discourse. And it has been. But Guthrie says there are a lot of things that go on outside the stained glass. Right?
But inside it, unfortunately.
And inside too, right. Yes, inside too. A lot of things have happened since his book was written, even the updates. So we must, if we truly believe that the church is an outward force, right, that we must go out, that our mission is to be in the world, we must tackle these tough things. So we're going to talk now about the reality of evil. Because the fact of evil is such a threat to what Christians affirm about God and God's good creation, we might expect that the Bible and Christian theology would try to solve the problem by trying in one way or another to explain away its terrible reality. So, you know how that works, right? To try to just, cheapen it and explain it away, to make light, or to try to double talk it, or Yeah, sweep it under the rug. Some people try to deal with the evil around them and in their own lives by pretending that it isn't there at all, or at least it is not as bad as it seems. They cheerfully remember that April showers bring May flowers. When the dog bites and the bee stings, they think of their favorite things. I love Guthrie. They promise themselves that the sun will come out tomorrow. In one way or another, they practice the power of positive thinking. Sometimes such a Pollyanna sentimentality has crept into the church, but the mainstream of Christian tradition has rejected it. Some of the worst injustice and suffering in the world is the result of good people simply refusing to acknowledge that evil exists and therefore doing nothing to challenge it. Another solution to the problem is the omelet theory. Eggs have to be broken if you want to make an omelet. If we look far enough ahead, we can see that evil contributes to good, and so it's really not evil at all. A war that slaughters millions of people can bring peace. If a church refuses to welcome and minister to some objectionable people who would drive its members away, it can grow financially and numerically and thus increase its influence in society. Political and economic policies that hurt some people can contribute to the welfare of most people. But even if some good does sometimes come from evil, does that make evil good? What kind of God would create a world in which wrong and the infliction of suffering is the law of progress toward right? Christians cannot dispose of the problem of evil as easily as that. Against all attempts to explain evil away in one way or another, Christian faith is uncompromisingly realistic. Immediately following the biblical story of the good God and God's good creation comes the story of the tempter and his satanic work. According to Jesus, the evil that was unleashed at the very beginning of history has been at work throughout all history. Will be there until the very end. Until the end of history, there will be wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation, famine, earthquake, suffering, false leaders, injustice, hatred, persecution of the righteous. History is not the story of gradual human progress in which there is less and less evil and more good. It is a story of past and present and future power of evil that threatens to spoil and destroy God's good creation. This unflinching, this unflinching realism about the reality of evil becomes even more intense at the event that stands at the center of all history, the cross of the Jesus whom Christians believe is God with us. Evil is so strong that it seems not just the enemy of God, but the victor over God. Good is defeated and evil triumphs. Hatred overcomes love. Justice loses and injustice wins. God's world becomes Satan's world. That is not the end of the story of Jesus, of course, but it is an inescapable part of it. The same cross that is a symbol of Christian faith in the powerful love and justice of God is also the symbol of the terrible reality and power of evil. If then we talk about the problem of evil as Christians gathered around the cross, no trivial, easy answers will do. Christian faith is not an escape from the problem of evil. It raises the problem to the nth degree. All right, so Guthrie is saying there is no frou-frou way to deal with evil. You must go at it head on, right? And that's the only way to deal with it. Positive thinking does not eradicate evil. It's interesting, in seminary, have you ever heard of the Niebuhr brothers? They were huge theologians. I mentioned them earlier today, actually. You had Richard Niebuhr and Reinhold Niebuhr, two brothers, theologians, very, very influential within the 20th century. They did teach, I believe they taught at Union. When the Second World War began to rage in Europe, the brothers split on what to do or how to view it. One brother, who was an extreme pacifist, said, Christians should not, raise arms. And the other said, well, you've got a war raging and innocent people are dying, lots of innocent people, it's our moral responsibility to go. Yes, war is horrible and killing is wrong, but this is something we have to do. So you get this, it's not a clear-cut answer. I mean, you have two theologians who grew up in the same house, had the same parents, and had probably had all the same opportunities, and yet two very different thoughts on this. But you can't also look at as saying that, well, this bad, good comes from bad things. That's, does the end justify the means? Right? Or do the means justify the end? It's just a few thousand people. I mean, so what? And this is what Guthrie is saying, this is not good either, right? So instead of trying to sweep evil under the rug, right, under the carpet in your living room, the Christian's responsibility is to go at it head on and deal with it. Because if you don't, you're fooling yourselves, right? It's not something that's going to go away. And Guthrie says towards the end of the paragraph, it doesn't get better towards the end. What happens? It gets worse. Jesus said this, right? This is not something, some wiry minister on TV said. This is what Jesus talked about. Jesus said, towards the end, these are the signs you will see. It gets worse.
And get really bad.
And gets really bad. And so, it's not going to just disappear. So we're going to start our section, the first section, the dark side of creation. It will help us to get to the heart of the problem if we discuss first what is usually called, natural evil. Evil that comes from natural causes, not influenced by human motives, decisions, or actions. Suffering that results from what Karl Barth has called the dark, or shadow side of God's good creation. A woman develops cancer and, after a long agonizing illness, dies, leaving a family without wife and mother. A storm rips through a city, leaving demolished homes, mangled bodies, and hunger and disease in its wake. Parents who have eagerly awaited their first child take her home from the hospital knowing that she is hopelessly deformed physically or mentally. A large part of a whole continent becomes a desert after years of unrelieved drought, and millions of men, women, and children die of malnutrition. And we ask, is there a God? Why did God let this happen? Or did God actually make this happen? 4 things can be said that help us understand such misfortunes, though nothing can be said to take the hurt away. All right? So remember, as we work through theology, especially when we deal with pain, with grief, with disaster, both natural and moral, so by the hands of humans, we can look at theologically how to understand it, but it doesn't take the pain away. This is what being pastoral is all about, right? So we must understand that if these things happen, and they do, I would be lying to you if I said they don't, that we can sit and try to understand how it happened and why it happened, but it doesn't take away the pain of someone in the midst of it, right? And that's why this is where we must be pastoral. And only being pastoral will work. No one wants to be lectured. No one wants, when someone comes to me and says, why? And it could be for a laundry list of things. Why did my spouse die? Why did I lose my job? Why did this happen? They don't want a lecture. People need to be comforted. And it's okay to say, I don't know. And I'm here. That's it. It's very simple. Because they don't need a lecture, right? So we must always understand that nothing can be said to take away the human hurt, right? This is a grieving process, right? People go through stages of grief. And as Christians, we should be there to help people through those stages, right? They don't want to know. That's not the time for you to bust out your copy of Guthrie and say, well, Guthrie said. No. Wrong. Even Guthrie would say, oh, please don't do that. You be there for that individual. But just keep that in mind. All right, so the world is not an unpredictable chaos, but at least a relatively ordered, intelligible system of interrelated parts that function in a relatively consistent way we can count on. What is he talking about? Let's talk about hurricanes, because I'm pretty familiar with that, living in Florida for a good part of my life. Hurricanes typically that come to and really hit the eastern seaboard or the southern states or the Gulf states typically come from two places, right? Coast of Africa, and then they barrel across the Atlantic, or in the Caribbean, right? Those are the ones that affect the eastern side of the United States. We know that when the waters are the warmest, hurricanes are the most dangerous. They produce the larger hurricanes, the stronger ones, the ones that cause more damage. We have hurricane seasons. We know exactly, we have an idea of a window of when these things happen, right? So if you live in Florida, they say, yeah, you could take a cruise during these months, but, you gamble, because you might meet up with a big old thing swirling around in the water. So if we know some of these things, it's not that nature just continually throws curveballs at humanity. Yes, she can be unpredictable at times. But we do have this thing called science, right? And we do know some things about how nature works, right? So if you buy a house on the Gulf Coast of Florida, are you taking a risk? Mm-hmm. Most definitely. I mean, you have those beautiful Gulf waters that I love. Yeah, fantastic fishing. The Gulf at times it looks like a sheet of glass. It's absolutely amazing. It's warm. It's a great place. But when a storm comes in, it changes really fast, really fast. And so, we know enough. So if you want to build a house directly on the beach, it's a risk you take. The insurance companies know that. It's very hard to get insurance if you can. You have to get it from the pool, and if you live in these states, from the state pool. It is what it is, right? So we do know that there are natural laws, right? There are some risk. It's not like people will do this blindly. We know what the risk is to do something like this, right? Yes, it's absolutely wonderful, but you roll the dice. How long will it take for a hurricane to roll my direction? Yeah. So there are the things that are there that are consistent, right? The laws of nature are typically pretty solid. It doesn't mean you don't get a wild card every now and then, right? Doesn't mean that in 1989 when we first moved to Florida, we had snow flurries on December 23rd. And I'm talking about Tampa. I'm not talking about the Panhandle. Mm-hmm. In Tampa Bay, we had snow flurries, and everyone was on the street looking up, gawking, because this white stuff was now falling in middle Florida. So there are things that happen that are unexpected, right? You get perfect storms. You get the perfect conditions that lend to this weird thing that's going on. But for the most part, these laws they're pretty static. They're there. They're there. So it's not that we are continually being blindsided by nature. It's not that Zeus is on top of Mount Olympus looking down saying, oh, what is Andy doing now? No, I don't like that. Let me hurl some lightning bolts at Andy. It's...
That would explain a lot.
Nature is, right? There are certain laws. That's why meteorology works. And it's gotten a lot better. I'm very impressed with how it is in Indiana. I mean, oh my God, there's no way it's going to snow tomorrow. It's 77, and then the next day it's snowing. So they've made leaps. So that's where we're going to end today, and we will continue with good old Mother Nature next week.
Thank you.